Hey yo, what is up? Welcome to Ninja Geek Games Part 2 of Blood Bowl 2nd Season Edition Learn to Play video. Today we're going to look at some of the basic fundamentals, how to set up a team for a drive, and then go over some of the basic rules found in the rulebook. Firstly, the dugouts. Each coach will have one of these that has areas for reserves, KO players, and dead and injured. Each of the dugouts has 3 tracks for keeping track of score, what round it is, and they'll need to move this before carrying out any action on that coach's turn, and an area to keep track of how many rerolls that coach has for the half. The ball is the most important part of the game and can be found either resting on the field in an unoccupied square or in the hands of a Blood Bowl player, represented by placing it on their base. We have a number of dice, a D8, which determines the random direction a ball will travel or scatter, 2D6, a D16 and 3 unique block die. And I'll go over some of the general principles associated with how the ball can move randomly. The first one is deviated, and generally represents when the ball is being kicked or a pass is veered wildly off target. To deviate a ball, you roll 1d8 for the direction and 1d6 for the number of squares it will move from the square in which it was placed. Whenever the term scatter is used, the ball will move from the square it was placed in 3 times before landing, each time moving 1 square in a random direction determined by rolling the d8. Lastly, the term bounce is generally used for when the ball hits the floor or is dropped as part of a fumble, and the ball will move 1 random square determined by the roll of a d8. Next, we'll briefly go over tackle zones. And a standing player exerts control over all the squares around them, and this is called their tackle zone. So here, this ogre has a tackle zone consisting of these 8 squares. If a player is open, it means they are not in the tackle zone of any opposition players. However, the ogre is now being marked by the black orc because it's in the orc's tackle zone. Generally, being in a tackle zone means that you'll get some negative modifiers when attempting any agility rolls. Lastly, we'll discuss prone and stunned players. If a player is knocked down for any reason as part of a block or blitz, or trips and falls as part of rushing, they are first placed prone in their square. Next, 2d6 are rolled by the opposing coach, who tries to break the armor value. If they don't succeed, the player remains prone until their next turn. If the armor value is broken, the opposing coach then rolls for injury. On a 2 to 7, the player is placed down, and on their next turn, all they can do is turn over at the end of the turn. A roll of 8 or 9 means the player is placed in the KO box, and a roll of 10 to 12 means that the coach gets to roll a d16 on the casualty table, and if they're lucky enough, can end up maiming or killing them. Note that each player has a characteristic table, and this is located in the back of the book. Movement allowance and strength are both shown as a simple value, whereas agility, passing ability and armor value are shown as a target number, meaning you have to roll that as a minimum, and therefore any modifiers to that roll can make it easier or harder to aim that target. We'll now look at setting up a team for kickoff. So the first thing you need to do before playing a game of Blood Bowl is to draft a team. And to do this, each coach will spend up to 1 million gold pieces on their players. And this includes sideline staff, team rerolls and apothecaries and so on. Each player has a specific cost, and a team must have a minimum of 11 players on their starting roster, but no more than 16. And also each team has a limited number of positionals that they can have on the roster. So for a one-off exhibition game, the first thing coaches do is each will roll a d6 and apply the weather depending on the result. So we have 7, which is perfect Blood Bowl weather. Next thing, each coach will roll a d6, with the coach rolling the highest deciding whether they want to kick off or return. If you kick the ball, the receiving team gets to play first. So we'll assume that the orcs rolled 5, they are electing to kick, so they'll set up first. Now that the kicking team is set up, there are a couple of things to note when you are setting up your team at the start of the drive, and that is the centre of the pitch is called the line of scrimmage, and there must be at least 3 players on that line of scrimmage between the 2 wide zones. Each wide zone can have no more than 2 players in it, and you can't have more than 11 players on the pitch, although some have tried. Once the ball is kicked and play begins, it's fair game to where any player can go. Now that the receiving team is set up following the same rules, the orcs can kick off. The first thing they need to do is select a kicker, and the kicker cannot be on the line of scrimmage or in the wide zones. The ball is then placed in any square in the opposing team's half, and as kicks are deemed wildly inaccurate, they will deviate. And if you remember, we said that is where we roll 1d6 for the number of squares the ball will move, and 1d8 for its direction. So here it will move direction 5, 2 spaces, 1, 2. This is where the ball lands, and before it bounces, kicking coach will then roll 2d6 and consult the kickoff table. When the kickoff table event is fully resolved, the ball will then bounce 1 square by rolling a d8 once to show where the ball's final resting place is. Once that's complete, the receiving team can then start their first turn. If at any time ball lands in a player's square after deviating, that player can attempt to catch it by making an agility roll with a -1 modifier. If the ball makes its way off the pitch for any reason, the receiving team can place the ball on any player they wish without having to make an agility roll. Once the turn begins, the first thing the active coach needs to do is move the turn marker, and then they can carry out a maximum of 1 action with each player. Once they've carried out actions with all the players they want to, or if there's a turnover, the opposing coach can then do the same. So let's take a look at some of the actions you can do during a turn. So the first action we're going to look at is a move action, where the players are sprinting about the field trying to mark players, get in space, or get in the way of the opposing team. Now when a player moves, they can move any number of squares equal to their movement allowance in any direction, moving into any adjacent unoccupied square. So this blitzer has a movement of 7, so they can move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now whenever a player performs any action that includes movement, they can attempt to gain 1 or 2 extra squares of movement through rushing. So this blitzer has moved their full allowance and could end their movement there. But the coach could also decide to rush, where they can move 1 adjacent square, but this is risky as they have to roll a d6 to do so. Any roll other than 1 means the player remains on their feet, and they can do this up to 2 times, as long as they don't get a 1. If a 1 is rolled, the player unfortunately slips and falls, and an armor roll is made. But we'll assume that they are steady on their feet. However, if they did fall through rushing, that would be an automatic turnover. Players that are prone can also make a move action. First they need to stand up, and this costs them 3 movement points, meaning that this 6 movement thrower now can only move 3. When moving, if they pass through a square containing the ball, they can make an unmodified agility roll to pick up the ball. If successful, it's placed on their base and the player can carry on moving. Note that there is a -1 modifier for every opposing team member that's marking them. In this case would be -1. However, they're able to pick up the ball as there are no tackle zones and can continue moving. Had they failed to pick up the ball would have bounced and would be an automatic turnover. So if the ball was dropped here, you would roll a d8 and it would bounce 1 square. 7 means it would have gone into this player's square, which means they would have a -1 modifier for catching a bouncing ball, plus an additional -1 modifier for being in an enemy tackle zone. Even if they had managed to catch the ball, it would still be a turnover. Note that when attempting any agility roll, a natural 6 always succeeds, and a 1 will always fail. Players who are being marked by opposing players can also move, but they first need to make a dodge roll, and this simulates them being tackled. It doesn't matter how many tackle zones the player is moving out from, they make 1 dodge roll that is unmodified. If they succeed, they can carry on moving, making any more dodge rolls if they leave tackle zones. If they fail a dodge roll, they are placed prone, the opposing coach makes an armor roll, and there's a turnover. It does matter with how many tackle zones they are moving into. So this player has to make a dodge roll moving from here to here, but because they are still being marked by 2 players, it means they get a -2 modifier to that dice roll. Had the player moved here, it'd be a -1 modifier because they're being marked by 1 player. Goblins are a little bit sneaky. If they fail a dodge roll, because they have the dodge skill, once per player turn, they can attempt to re-roll their dodge roll. Also, because they're so tiny, they have the trait Stunty, which means that when they move into a square and are marked, they ignore those -1 modifiers, meaning they can dodge a little bit more easy because they're harder to catch. Pesky little runts. New to this edition of Blood Bowl is jumping, where once during their activation the moving player can attempt to jump over a single adjacent square that is occupied by a prone or stunned player, but must be into an unoccupied square beyond. So in this example, if this orc was prone and this player was attempting to move, they could jump over the orc and land in one of these 3 squares. If they were coming at the diagonal, they'd be attempting to jump into one of these 3 squares. When making the jump, the player first moves into the square they wish to jump to, and the coach then makes an agility roll, applying a negative modifier equal to the number of players that were marking the jumping player in the square they jumped from, or equal to the number of players that are marking the jumping player in the square they've jumped to, whichever is greater. So in this instance, one player was marking this player, so they have a -1 modifier. Had there been 2 goblins here, when this player jumped, this would now be a -2 modifier, remembering that the player would also have to dodge leaving the marked square as well. If the player fails the jump, they fall down in the square they were jumping to. However, if they roll a natural 1 when jumping, they fall over in the square they were jumping from. Regardless, in either case, there's an armor roll and it's a turnover. So next we're going to look at blocking, which is my favourite part of the game. And a block is deemed as a very rough tackle. Now when a standing player is activated for a block action, they immediately nominate a single standing opposition player that they are currently marking and declare they'll take a block action. So in this example, the ogre can block here, Blitzer can block here, and the lineman can block here. These 2 players can't block because they're not marking any players. When performing a block, the blocking player cannot move before or after, and if the player was prone at the start of the turn, they cannot stand up to make a block, because that actually becomes a blitz, which we'll talk about later. The block action is resolved using these special dice, and how many dice are rolled depends on the strength difference between the players involved in the block. The first thing you need to do when declaring a block action is to compare the strength characteristic of both the players involved. If both players have the same strength characteristic, after modification, 1 dice is rolled. If one player has higher strength characteristic after modification, 2 dice are rolled, where the coach with the higher strength chooses the result. If one player has a strength characteristic that is more than double than their opponent after modifications, 3 block dice are rolled, with the coach with the stronger player selecting which result to apply. So in this instance, the ogre is strength 5, the black orc is strength 4, so the ogre coach gets to roll 2 block dice and apply the result of one of the die. Here, the lineman is strength 3, but the black orc is strength 4, meaning that if the lineman was stupid enough to block the orc, they would roll 2 dice, but the orc coach would get to choose which dice to resolve. However, players from the offense and defense can assist and modify the strength score. An offensive assist is when a teammate of the active player that is performing the block action is able to assist. To offer an offensive assist, a player must be marking the opposition player as the target of their teammate's block action. Each offensive assist provides a +1 modification to the strength. So here, this lineman has a strength of 3, this orc has a strength of 4. If this thrower is able to mark the black orc before the block, this lineman now gets +1 strength as an offensive assist, meaning the strength of each player is 4, so 1 dice is resolved. Defensive assists work the same on the inactive team, that is a teammate of the player being targeted by the block action is able to assist. So here, this blitzer will block this goblin with a strength of 3 to 2, meaning the blitzer gets 2 dice. However, if this was the case, this goblin is able to assist, meaning the strengths are now both 3, so 1 dice roll is rolled. It's important to note that you cannot assist offensively or defensively if you are being marked. So if this goblin was placed next to this black orc and the ogre decided to block Strength 5 against Strength 4. You cannot use this Goblin as the defensive assist for a +1 modification because they are in a tackle zone of the lineman, i.e. they are being marked. What we'll do now is we'll go over some of the symbols that are shown on the dice, as well as skills that can support blocking with these teams. First of all, this symbol is a player down, where something has gone terribly wrong with the block, and the player performing the block is actually knocked down. So if the thrower was attempting to block the Black Orc and rolled this, they would actually become knocked down, an armor roll is made, and it's an automatic turnover. This result means both down, and in general neither player comes off particularly well. Both the active player and the target player of the block are knocked down. So in normal circumstances, if the Goblin blocked the Blitzer and rolled this both down result, the Goblin would go down, where an armor roll would be made, and so would the Blitzer. However, the Blitzer has the block skill, which means that they can choose to ignore this effect. And if both players had the block skill, both could ignore the effect, meaning they remain on their feet. With regards to the both down, the Imperial Nobility bodyguards have a skill called Wrestle, meaning that if they are blocking or being blocked, and this is the result, they can choose to ignore that result, and instead both players are placed prone, but no armor roll is made. If they're the active team and they were carrying the ball, it'll bounce one square and there's a turnover. Otherwise, there's no turnover. And no armor roll made. As the Black Orcs have the Brawler skill, if they are also performing a block and roll a both down result, they can re-roll a single die. This symbol, if chosen, means pushback, where the active player gives their opponent an almighty shove, forcing them backwards. The target of the block action is pushed one square by the active player. The active player can follow up into the square that's been vacated. So in this instance, the Ogre has pushed back the Orc, and when pushing back, it will be into one of these 3 squares. You can then choose to follow up for free if they wish to. If they push back the Goblin on a diagonal, the Goblin then is pushed back into one of these 3 squares, again decided by the Ogre player. And they can follow up. So the Black Orcs come with the grab skill, which utilises the pushback result on the block dice. And this means as a result of a pushback, so here the Orc would push the Ogre back. There's only 2 options, here or here. But with the grab skill, the Orc can actually push them here and even follow up. Likewise, the bodyguards have the stand firm skill, which means that any block action that results in a pushback, including the POW, which we'll talk about later, they could ignore the push and stay where they are. However, this is optional, and they can choose to be pushed back if they want to. And lastly, the Imperial Nobility linemen have a skill called Fend. So if this Black Orc push back the lineman into one of these 3 squares, the Fend skill actually prevents the Orc from following up, even if they wanted to. The next icon on the dice is the Stumble, where the target of the block is pushed over, or pushed back and knocked over, with the chance to follow up, where an armor roll is made. However, with this symbol here, if the player being blocked has dodge skill, they're able to skillfully stay on their feet. So if this Blitzer had a defender stumble against the Goblin who has dodge, they're instead just pushed back and not knocked to the floor. The last result is the POW, and it's basically a tremendous block, and the target keels over, lands flat on their back, and there are no skills that can save the knockdown. Again, armor roll is made. If at any time a player is pushed off the pitch as a result of a block, the crowd jump in and give him a good old kick in, with the opposing coach can then bypass the armor roll and roll straight for injury. If the player is not KO'd or injured, they go into the reserves box, ready to start the next drive. So the next action we're going to talk about is a blitz action. And once per turn, a single standing or prone player on the active team can be activated to perform a blitz action. And it's really important that you declare this action before activating that player. When a player blitzes, they move exactly as described in the movement section earlier, dodging and jumping if needed. But in addition to moving, they can also carry out a block action that costs 1 point of movement. You can carry out this block action before moving, after moving, as long as you have the movement allowance to do so. So as an example here, this blitzer wants to block this goblin. As part of the blitz action, they can move into an adjacent space, perform the block, carry out the block in full, and then carry on moving if they want to. If they want to, they can pick up the ball on the way through, because this is a free action, move and continue the blitz. As mentioned, you can block first and then move your allowance, remembering that that block costs 1 movement, and also remembering that if you block a player and they get pushed back, that is still a free action, doesn't cost movement to follow up. If you want to block with a prone player, this is also deemed a blitz. So they must stand up, remembering this costs 3 movement points, then carrying out the block, and continuing to move if you want to. Lastly, if the player has moved their full allowance and they still need to blitz, they can perform a rush, where they need to move 1 square to get adjacent to the player by rolling the d6. If they're still on their feet, they then have to roll the dice again in order to make the block. If they roll a 1, they fall on their face and they can't make the block. And it's really important to remember that this blitz action can only be carried out by 1 player per turn. So the next thing we're going to look at is the foul action. Kick them till they're down, and when they're down, keep kicking them. Now fouling can only be carried out once per team turn by 1 player. When activated, the coach has to declare there is a foul action and which prone or stunned player is the target of the foul. The active player can move, carry out the foul, but that then ends their turn. To carry out the foul, you roll 2d6 to try and break the armour, gaining a +1 modifier for every offensive assist they have. This goblin is unable to provide an assist because they are being marked by the ogre. Now this is a little risky, because if you ever roll a double on armour or injury rolls during a foul action, then you have the potential to be sent off. The first thing you need to do, if the referee spots you, is you can argue the call by rolling a d6. On a roll of 1, the referee ejects you from the game regardless. The remainder of the game you can no longer argue the call, and you have a negative modifier to one of the results on the kickoff table. A result of 2 to 5 means the referee doesn't really care, but you're still sent off. And if you're lucky enough to roll a 6, the referee sees your point of view and doesn't send you off. However, regardless of the result of the argue the call roll, it is still a turnover. So before we go into passing, we're just going to quickly look at handing off the ball. Handoff is an action that can be carried out once per turn, 1 player on the active team, where the player simply attempts to hand the ball to an adjacent standing teammate. The player can move before the handoff, hand them the ball, and the player then makes an agility roll. Note that it doesn't matter that the player doing the handoff is being marked. Negative modifiers only come into effect if the player receiving or catching the ball is being marked. So here, they'd have a -1 modifier. Once the handoff is complete, the player that carried out the action has to end their activation. However, this player, if they haven't activated this turn, they can still carry out an action. If when attempting to catch a ball from a handoff they fail, the ball will bounce 1 square and it becomes an automatic turnover. So next we're going to talk about the pass action, where once per team turn a player on the active team may perform this action in order to pass the ball to another square. The target square can be occupied by a standing player, but can also be thrown to a prone or stunned player, or even an unoccupied square. The pass action can be further defined as being a quick pass, short pass, long pass, or long bomb. and depending on the distance, there may be negative modifiers applied. The first thing you need to do is measure the range, then test for accuracy by the coach of the player performing the pass rolling a d6 to determine the accuracy of the pass. And the success is dependent on the thrower's passing ability. Unless the pass is fumbled, an opposition player may be able to interfere with the pass hoping to deflect or intercept it, but if it's not fumbled or interfered with, the path itself is resolved with a catch. First thing you need to do is measure the range, and here we have the range ruler. This circle goes over the head of the active player carrying out the pass action, and here it's split into ranges from quick, short, long pass and long bomb. So we'll first assume they're passing to this player. We can see that it's within this range, so it's a quick pass. Now before throwing, the active player can actually move before throwing, but after the action is complete, their turn is over. And they can also move, pick up the ball and then attempt the pass action. So as this is a quick pass, there is no modifier. So the passing ability for an Imperial thrower is 3+, and we'll assume they've rolled a 3+. This is deemed an accurate pass, where the receiver now has to roll in an attempt to catch it, and makes an unmodified roll based on their agility. And the thrown player's action ends. The crowd go wild. Now, if the pass is failed, and the passing ability roll, then the ball will scatter from the target square. And if you remember, we said scattering was rolling a d8 3 times to find the square the ball will land in. So in this example, it's inaccurate. The ball should land here. It goes 1 to the right, 1 down, and 1 to the right again. This is where the ball actually lands, and it will then bounce. 6. Coincidentally, it bounces into the hands of a teammate. Now they can attempt to catch the ball, but because it's a bouncing ball, it'll have a -1 modifier. There's also being marked, so it's another -1 modifier. So they would need to roll a 6. Note that because the ball is bounced, it's a turnover. Had the player been here and caught the inaccurate pass, because the ball hasn't touched the floor, the nobility team is still active and continue with their turn. Although the thrower was very, very, very lucky. For longer range passes, so we'll assume that the thrower is now throwing to this player, which is now a short pass, which means they get a -1 modifier for the passing ability. If again they fail the passing ability die roll, the dice roll is a 1 after modifications have been applied, in which case this is true, and the ball deviates from this square. And if you remember, deviate is 1 roll of a d8 and 1 roll of a d6, so it could end up going anywhere. So we have direction 1, 6. So that from here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which lands near the touchline. I'll roll 4, so it bounces near to the touchline. I'm not sure if you can see that on the screen, but you can see that is miles away from where they wanted the ball to go. It's like he's greased up his hands. If the roll is a natural 1, the pass fails regardless. The ball bounces 1 square in a random direction, determined by a d8, and is also a turnover, even if caught by an adjacent player of the same team. The next thing we'll look at is interfering. So we'll assume the thrower here wants to attempt to throw it all the way over here to the blitzer. They're within range, however, because the range is border between a short pass and a long pass, you always move to the longer. So that is a long pass with a -2 modifier. Rolling the dice, we'll assume it's successful. Now because this orc is at least partly beneath the range ruler, they can attempt to interfere by deflecting the pass, which is deemed pass interference. As we saw, the pass was accurate. Attempting to deflect the pass has a -3 modifier. Remembering that 6 is always a successful result. Attempting to interfere with an inaccurate pass, it's only a -2 modifier. If the player is attempting to interfere with a wildly inaccurate pass, you apply a -1 modifier. Remembering to apply an additional -1 modifier for being marked. If they'd rolled a 6, they successfully deflect the ball mid-air and can now make an attempt to intercept. And to do this, they make another agility roll, -1 modifier for interception, plus here another -1 for being marked. If they successfully catch it, they've intercepted the ball and it's an automatic turnover. However, if they fail, the ball will scatter from the square they occupy, and scattering is moving the ball 3 times based on the roll of a D8. The ball will land there and then bounce and land here. We'll attempt to catch it. We do, but it's a turnover because the ball bounced. We're now going to look at throwing other players, which is just a brilliant part of the game. So this troll here has a trait throw teammate, which means that anyone with the skill, the right stuff that these goblin bruisers have, can be thrown. Players that are prone when carrying out the throw teammate action, all the actions for completing a normal pass as before are carried out, where you measure range, which can only be a quick throw and a short throw. You test for quality by making a passing ability roll. Then you resolve the throw. Instead of catching, instead roll to see how the thrown player lands. And note that you can also throw players at unoccupied squares, or you could throw this poor goblin at another player. When attempting a throw, we'll assume that the troll is going to throw this goblin at this lineman with the ball. You measure range. There is no modifier for a short pass. For a quick pass, but there is a -1 modifier for a short pass, taking into considerations any negative modifiers for being marked. If the passing ability roll is successful and or a natural 6, it's deemed a superb throw, where the thrown player finds it easier to land. If the passing ability test is failed, the throw is still successful, but after scattering, the thrown player actually finds it a lot harder to land. If the dice roll is a 1 after modifiers taken into consideration, this is deemed a terrible throw, where the thrown player actually deviates from the square occupied by the troll. And if a natural one is rolled, the troll will fumble and drop the goblin, and will bounce 1 square based on the roll of a D8 using the scatter template. Now, apart from the fumble and the deviate, a superb and successful throw means that the thrown player will scatter. So we'll assume this goblin was thrown to here, they scatter, end up landing here. If it was a superb throw, there are no modifiers to the agility roll that this goblin has to make to land safely. If it's a successful throw, there's a -1 modifier. A terrible throw where they've deviated, it's a -2 modifier. And if they were fumbled from the throwing square, it's a -1 modifier. However, because they are being marked by 2 nobility linemen, this goblin would also have a -2 modifier to their agility roll. If they successfully land and or roll a natural 6, they land safely and can continue moving if they haven't already done so. However, if they fail this test, they land badly and will fall over where an armor roll is made. If they were carrying the ball at that time, it bounces 1 square. However, as they weren't carrying the ball, because the attempt was to hit this guy, there is no turnover for this. Now, had they been lucky enough to throw this troll at this player is knocked down, where an armor roll is made against them. The ball will bounce 1 square, so will the goblin. Now, if this goblin was thrown and was prone or stunned during the throw action whilst being picked up by the troll, they're not allowed to attempt to land, and after scattering will bounce 1 square and automatically fall over, meaning there's another armor roll against them. And if the throw causes the thrown player to land out of bounds, the crowd give them a good kick in, where they can be KO'd, injured, or stunned, where they stay in the reserves box. One thing to remember when attempting to throw a goblin with the trolls is the trolls have a trait called Always Hungry, and this means before you even attempt to throw the goblin, you've got to see if the troll eats it first. So the coach will roll a d6. On a roll of 2+, we can continue with the throw as normal. If they roll a 1, they then have to roll again, and on a 2+, the goblin squirms free, and it's classed as a fumble. If they rolled a 1 on this second roll, the goblin teammate has been eaten and digested and is removed from the team roster list. And if they were carrying the ball, it bounces 1 square. The troll would eat the ball. Not enough protein. So if at any point during the active player's turn they find themselves in the end zone, the game stops immediately, the coach gets bragging rights for a couple of minutes, and they move their token up the score track. The scoring team then set up first for kickoff, following another drive. Any players that were in the KO box can attempt to recover by each coach rolling a d6 for each of the players, hoping to gain a 4+. And as you saw here, this was a rushing touchdown, meaning that they carried the ball into the end zone. But likewise, you can move players into the end zone without the ball and perform a throwing action or perhaps a handoff in an attempt to score. There are some bizarre circumstances where you can actually score in the opponent's turn, so the Black Orc has no option but to block this blitzer here. And unfortunately, rolls a pushback and has no re-rolls to spare, so has to push the opponent here. We're assuming he hasn't got the grab skill. What will happen then? It's still the touchdown, but the coach of the Imperial Nobility would then have to kick off again, but they also move their turn marker 1 space forward. So that's part 2 of the Learn to Play for Blood Bowl 2nd Season edition. This was just a basic summary of all the rules in the rule book. I'm not going to go over all 120 pages of it, but I just went over some of the skills, some of the basic players on the roster, and how to carry out the actions. So this is Ninja Geek Games. Cheers!